But first, we're going to talk about nuclear power and why the federal government has made the decision to include it in its clean energy vision for the future. We're going to be joined shortly by Susan O'Donnell from New Brunswick. She's a member of a local activist group in Fredericton, organizing to stop new nuclear power plants coming to her province. And she has a particular message for us here in BC. In its September throne speech, the Canadian government signalled its intention to fund the development of prototype nuclear power reactors as part of its investment in clean technology companies. New Brunswick will likely be the second province to receive federal funding for new nuclear reactors. The province and its public utility, NB Power, gave $5 million each to two nuclear energy companies from the US and the UK. These companies then established offices in St. John and applied for federal funding. In May, the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick, CRED-NB, was formed to oppose the proposed nuclear reactors and advocate for renewable energy. Susan O'Donnell is a researcher and adjunct professor with the Department of Sociology at the University of New Brunswick, and she's with CRED-NB. And Susan O'Donnell joins me today. Hello, Susan.
Hi, Jane. Thanks for having me.
I'm happy you could join us. How did nuclear energy become part of a clean energy strategy?
Well, unfortunately, Jane, it's politics. That's what really it's about. The nuclear industry has been trying for years to label itself a clean energy industry, and it's been working very hard at the political level to make that happen. So, for example, about a year ago, last December, there was an MOU signed between the provinces, my province in New Brunswick, with Ontario, and also the province of Saskatchewan, to lobby for these new nuclear reactors to be funded at the federal level. And one of the points in the MOU was that they would work together to convince the government or lobby the federal government, the provinces did, to make sure that the federal government labeled them clean energy. And that's indeed what happened, as you mentioned in the throne speech.
I guess the federal government has been in the business of funding the nuclear industry for a long time now.
Yes, and in fact, the main funding goes to the Atomic Energy Limited of Canada, AECL. And currently, in the current budget, I believe they're getting $1.2 billion. Most of that money is turned over, and it has been for the last number of years, to a consortium of private companies, the largest of which and the controlling partner in that private consortium is SNC-Lavalin. So it's a very complicated relationship that involves public money being handed over to the nuclear industry for development, and it's a very powerful lobby and industry as well.
Now, there's a new kind of nuclear reactor called an SMR, which stands for Small Modular Reactor. What is it like? What is it?
Well, it's somewhat smaller. The idea is that, first of all, it's not really new technology. They're calling it new technology. There's parts of it that's new, but it's smaller than the big CANDU reactors that we currently have. The interesting thing, and where this could tie into British Columbia, Jane, is kind of an interesting one. And that is that how the government and how the industry is selling these smaller reactors is saying, well, they're smaller, so let's put them, or we can put them, in places where they do not have other reliable energy sources. So the target market in Canada for these reactors is remote off-grid communities that are currently using diesel fuel for their power. Many of these are First Nations communities, including, there's about 50 in British Columbia that are First Nation communities using diesel power. And these are the targets for these new nuclear reactors in Canada.
So is that what's being proposed for New Brunswick?
What New Brunswick is going to get is prototype reactors that are meant to be demonstration projects. And if they work, which we won't know about that till about 15 years down the road, that's how long it's going to take if they do get the funding. If they work, then the idea is that a factory can be set up somewhere to build these things in a kind of an assembly line. And then ideally, if the projections are correct and they can sell them to all these remote First Nations and Inuit communities, then they can be rolled out somehow, get them on a series of transport trucks and set them up in these communities. But the idea is that New Brunswick would build the prototypes that would be rolled out across the country if successful.
It's horrifying to hear of small nuclear reactors dotted around Canada, especially in remote communities. What are the environmental risks? I mean, are they the same as the big reactors, that something can happen and then there can be a meltdown?
Well, meltdowns are always a concern. The risk of, there's a couple of risks. There's different levels of radioactive materials that are created when you have a nuclear reactor. So let's just say we take a remote First Nation in British Columbia, for example. So you can put a nuclear reactor there if you can get it there. Getting it there and getting it set up is a logistical issue in itself. The environmental concerns are, first of all, what do you do with the fuel? That's called high-level waste. And that's the responsibility of the federal government, because nuclear comes under the federal government. The federal government would have to figure out what to do with that waste and how to get it out, et cetera. That's a problem. The bigger problem, I would say, for the remote First Nation communities is that once the nuclear reactor has been operational there, that facility becomes radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. And that's called medium level radioactive waste. And then you have the low level, which is everything like the rags that were used to clean, et cetera. Because once you start the nuclear reactor chain, everything that comes in contact with it becomes radioactive. And so then you have these disposal problems. If, I don't know, let's just say that the expected lifespan of one of these reactors is 30 years. So then when 30 years is over, you have this radioactive hulk in a remote community, as you say, dotted across the countryside. It's a huge concern.
Have First Nations shown an interest in having this kind of technology in their communities?
This is the other strange thing about this whole process, Jane, is the opposite. In fact, the Assembly of First Nations, the AFN, which, as you know, represents all the 600 plus chiefs of the official Indian Act First Nations across the country, passed a resolution in December 2018 specifically against SMRs. They said they do not want the government to fund them and they do not want them in their communities. So at the political level, you have the AFN saying we don't want them. But at the other level, the government has this as the main part of their business plan for why they're funding these. So there's other reasons why these are being funded and proposed that in some ways you could say have nothing to do with reality. You actually have an expert in Vancouver. His name is M.V. Ramana. He's at the University of British Columbia. He's an expert on the economics of nuclear reactors, and he and his team have done a study specifically about the viability of the market for these nuclear reactors across the country. And what his research found, and it was published in September in a peer-reviewed journal, is there is not enough of a market to make the case for everything that I've been talking about, for building, 200 reactors and putting them across the country. Even if they could theoretically do that, there isn't a market. The market would not pay for what's required to build them in the first place.
It sounds like we should follow up with him about that. But I wanted to get back to something you said a moment ago when you said there are other reasons. What were you referring to?
The nuclear industry is desperate right now. It's been in decline for a number of years. We haven't had a new CANDU reactor, for example, in Canada built in, decades and decades. Nuclear energy is the most expensive energy out there. So they're desperate. And so about 10 years ago, they tried to have a nuclear renaissance with more large nuclear reactors. That didn't work. And so now they're trying this small thing. I would say, just from my analysis, that there's three reasons why this is going ahead, despite what we've just discussed, that it doesn't make any sense. First of all, and two of them have to do, unfortunately, well, three of them have to do with greed, I would say, but one of them has to do with the money. You always, in these situations, you go, if it doesn't make sense, follow the money. And I just mentioned that there's more than $1 billion going largely into private sector hands from the federal government, federal taxpayers. And there's a lot of vested interest that doesn't want that tap to stop flowing. The new money that's being proposed is also to private sector companies, most of whom are actually just recently based in Canada. They're mostly from the US and the UK. So there's a lot of money flowing. And whenever there's money flowing, there's vested interest to keep that money flowing. So that's one reason. And the nuclear industry has been lobbying hard to make sure that that money keeps flowing for sure. There's another reason that I'm just starting to explore now, but there are researchers in the UK who've been doing a lot of work on this, which is the link between the capacity in the civilian nuclear industry and the military industry, which, as you know, has to do with nuclear weapons. So the problem is, if we don't have a strong civilian nuclear industry, civilian meaning nuclear power that we've been talking about, you do not have the capacity that's required to also have a military nuclear industry for nuclear weapons. So we need to have those people working and trained, and new university students being trained, et cetera, for the civilian industry in order to keep the military industry alive. And in fact, Rolls-Royce, which is a big manufacturer of both civilian and military nuclear technology in the UK, has specifically said that they need to keep their civilian industry going in order to keep their military side industry going. Those are the two reasons. So the money thing, the need to have personnel that can supply the military need for nuclear weapons. And then the third reason really is about consumer demand, that somehow the nuclear industry has convinced people that they need this limitless supply of energy to run devices, et cetera. And so you have a demand by people who basically do not want to be told that we need to cut the level of energy that we're using right now. But there are many ways that can be done through conservation and energy efficiency.
Now, I understand that the EU's Green New Deal specifically excludes investment in nuclear energy.
Right.
And why is that?
Well, they do something that unfortunately we don't have here. They have a special environmental lens that they put on all those major investments into the Green Energy Fund. And that was something that was done with civil society input. And what they did is they came up with a framework with guidelines for judging all of the potential expenditures for their Green Energy Fund. And when they applied that framework, they found that in fact the whole nuclear supply chain is not a net zero emitter, and in fact is much more of an emitter than other renewable energy technologies that do fit, that are eligible for the Green Energy Fund. So they excluded nuclear because it's an emitter of carbon.
It sounds like it doesn't really have a place in any kind of clean energy plan that the Canadian government might come up with that claims to be net zero then.
I would definitely agree with that. But unfortunately, the case is being made. We had the minister, Seamus O'Regan, the Minister of Natural Resources, federal minister, who said that it's impossible to meet net zero targets without nuclear. And at the same time, a number of weeks later, when he was making the first funding announcement to the Ontario company, and he was asked by a reporter, are these proposed new nuclear reactors going to be ready by 2030 when we have to hit our main targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Well, the answer is no. There's no way, and even the industry admits, and the government, that there's no way that these new reactors can be online by 2030. I mean, if they are successful, we're probably talking about 2040. And so really, it's just a fallacy and a fantasy that somehow this is going to, in any way, shape, or form, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
Is there opposition building nationally to this move to build new nuclear power plants?
Yeah, there is. I suppose most famously, David Suzuki made a remark that was widely reported, his reaction when he was told what the minister said about no path to net zero without nuclear, and asked what he thought of that. He said, "I want to puke." And in fact, I would say that as environmental groups have become aware of these plans because there's been a shroud of secrecy around them. We have Greenpeace has been very active, the Sierra Club Foundation Canada has been very active. The Canadian Environmental Law Association is taking a leading role in coordinating the opposition. And in fact, they have right now on their website a sign up for groups who are opposed to this. Certainly, I can speak for New Brunswick. We have 8 environmental organizations in our coalition in New Brunswick. But the main problem is you can't have opposition if you're not informed. And that's a big modus operandi of the nuclear industry, is keep this thing out of the public eye, right? If you can shroud it in secrecy, call it clean technology, make sure nobody knows about it, then there will be no public opposition. But yes, as soon as the main environmental groups got wind of it, there certainly has been opposition.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me, and I think it will go a long way to raising awareness among our listeners. I certainly had no idea that there were planned to be small nuclear plants dotted around the country. So I really appreciate you talking to me today, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, Jane. Thank you very much.
I've been speaking with Susan O'Donnell. She's a researcher and adjunct professor with the Department of Sociology at the University of New Brunswick, and she's with the recently formed Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick. I spoke with Susan O'Donnell earlier this week. You're listening to Redeye on Vancouver Cooperative Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Jane Williams.